Okay. So we have seen the HTTP and observable calls, how to actually utilize the response and stuff, right? Now let's see how we can handle an exception situation. Because when we normally have endpoint calls, right, exceptions are always like, calls are always prompt exceptions, and we our software should be compliant enough to actually handle the exceptions and show proper messaging and stuff, right? So today we'll see how to handle that part basically. um, what we have is like we have components created, right? Let's take one of the component called personal info. Let me close other component called component names, because the way we are going to handle exception, once we understand in the same one of the component, it's kind of a same across all the components, right? Now so let's first start with the service. So where we actually do the actual endpoint call. So here we're actually using HTTP client, right? And then we are saying get with some of the source, and the source is, for instance, this endpoint. So when we talk about endpoint, right, or REST URL, there can be multiple situations where your server is not responding, right? There can be multiple HTTP error codes like 500 or 504 or 404, right? So many. But end of the day, we should not actually let our app kind of a crash, or not able to handle those exceptions just because of one of the trip is actually failed, right? So here, in order to handle that exception, it's just not exception. We normally do two main things. One is to retry, and this retry can be multiple times based on a requirement and based on the server response or based on the traffic you have, right? You can actually make a retry, and then if after some retries, if you see the same behavior, then we have to catch the exception. This is how we follow. It's same as if you understand the exception handling. What do? We normally try to use um, we normally have a try catch, right? So what does it mean? It means that, okay, fine. I mean, let's enable the block, even if we know that it's going to be an exception prone. Okay, let's allow it to execute till whatever steps it is going on. If every step is fine, then fine. Otherwise, if something goes wrong, then anyways, you can actually have a catch, right? Where we are actually giving one step execution. Now here, what we are doing, we will see how to retry the rest call again, and then we'll see after some retries. See, retry is not mandatory, but this is something which is kind of a best practice we have, and also it is not applied for every endpoint call. Okay, you have to prioritize on which endpoint call. For instance, if you're actually trying to actually for send an email, send a message, or update some employee details, and then prepare email and stuff, right? For instance, so updating employee details is kind of, let's say, is mandatory, right? Where you can't actually miss something, where there are chain of requests being sent. So in those chains, if all the requests are actually kind of dependent, and based on one of the success execution, you want to do the next step, right? In those situations, yes, if something goes wrong, you can actually give a retry shot to see if details are getting updated, and can move on. So it all depends on situation where you need the retry or not and stuff. Okay, now let's go ahead and see how we can actually handle it. So now we know that we have two steps: one to retry and to handle exception. So so where do we need exceptions? If something goes wrong, where exactly do we need exceptions? So first and foremost step, we need to handle the exception at the at the first step of call, which means when we are actually trying to get or trip some endpoint, this is the first step where we should make sure that this is resilient code. Whatever happens, this code should not break. Even if whatever comes up in from here, it should go smoothly. It should not actually propagate from this method with an exception. Now, in order to do that, first let's see how we can actually handle the exception here. Excuse me. So when we talk about get, if you see, get always actually gives out the observables, right? And for observables, we have something called pipe, where you can actually chain up the steps. So pipe again will actually give up the same whatever output it is actually getting. This is kind of a chain actions we are performing on top of the get. Now this will be an overlap on as soon as you get some response, it can be a valid response or an invalid response or some exception response. Whatever it gets, this will be propagated. So in this pipe, right, you can actually have multiple things which you can do. The first step, what you can do is retry. So retry again. So whatever we are learning here is RxJS API. So here, if you want to use retry, you have to import it first. So here, let me have an import statement for RxJS. So RxJS is my main API, right? And then here I have something called operators. So operators I have many. So one of them is retry. I'm going to use retry. And as I said, one is retry, and I also have something called catch error. Perfect. We're going to use these two. So now when I say retry, right, off, we can actually give how many number of times you want to retry. Let's say I'm going to give some big number 4, so that I can we can actually see if it is actually tripping up the endpoint, right, these many times after the first call, right, before it actually propagates any handle, right? So that's a retry. And then other actions, the chained up actions, you can actually perform in the same pipe with comma. So now what I want to do, I want to actually catch error. Now in this catch error, we can actually give a func pointer. So let me create a quick, um, let me just say as handle exception, maybe handle exception or handle error. And this, I want my error to be sent to this handle, and this func method, let's give it here, this dot handle error. So this is going to automatically call this method, and it will actually propagate, it will give us the error details we have, right? So here what I'm going to do, I'm going to have console.log of, let's say, E. I want to print the complete error message I have, right? And once the handler is done, anyways, I have to throw error of anything message here, I think. Okay, cool. So so now we have this retry, and then we have catch error. In the catch error, we created a func method handle error. So this catch error will automatically pass on the complete exception details with stack trace and everything. And here you can do a first level handling. Now the first level handling meaning, let's say for instance, if you are planning for logging exception into some file systems or DB, you can do that. And as soon as you do the first level, and then what you have to do, you have to propagate whoever have subscribed to our observables. So to those subscribers, you have to intimate them saying the request which you have called for is not successful and there is an exception. So whoever is calling, so for instance, now we are actually talking about one of the component, we'll see how to handle here. Whoever is subscribed to our observable, we have to let them know there is an exception. Now, so this is the first step I have. For instance, here I said console log, we're actually logging here. Let's say I'm gonna actually append this with at core service. So this will actually show details of error at core service, for instance. This is how we do. So here we are retrying the request for a couple of times, and then if it doesn't actually succeed, then it will actually immediately hold up to the catch error, and the catch error will automatically use the selector we created, and selector will automatically do whatever handling or logging we are doing, and then throw back the error again. So this throwback error again is gonna go back. If you see here, the catch error is gonna give back again in the same observable we have. That's a chain reaction we did. And now this is how we normally handle the error at the service level where we're actually tripping. Now, as soon as we get the handling of error, as soon as it actually comes back to the component, for instance, right? Now here we subscribe it. Now, how can I know that there is an exception? So here in the component itself, we have, as soon as we get response, we have multiple handlings which we can do. One is the response, for instance. The first param of subscribe which we normally get is response, which we have already seen, for instance. And also we can have multiple. If you see, there is one more called error. The second param is going to be error, for instance. So here what I'm going to do, I'm going to log my exception at component level. So here I'm going to say error and just say at consumer. So now in this situation of error, we know that what exactly happened. Now which means in the response situation, which means the request was successful. In the error situation, the request was not successful, which means you can do some stuff here. Yeah, you can actually even include this in your braces to do multiple statement. If you have a single statement, you can actually create a func pattern. If you have multiple statements, you can just create a block like this, and then you can actually write a couple of things here. So this is how we handle exception when we are actually making a endpoint calls. So now let's see how it works. So here we have a we are not going to create an exception now, but as is, let's see how this works, because we are actually enabling the retries and stuff, right? Let's go back here. Now it's time to actually look into the developer tools, because we want to see how the trips are happening. So let me open this up. Let me just delete all the breakpoints. I am interested more on a console and network, right? So let me refresh the page, go to network. So if I go to network here, so if you see, employee JSON is being called twice, right? If you remember our previous class, we did this, the employee JSON, where it actually called twice. Right? Now what I'm going to do, I'm going to do some error in the endpoint, for instance, which will actually make multiple trips, because we are actually kind of retrying. First thing, even before exception, we'll say this. So now, in order to actually raise an exception, for instance, let's say I'm going to actually tweak this URL. Let's say I'm going to say assets123. Now I don't have a folder called assets123, which means the complete URL, right, actually doesn't make sense, because this URL doesn't exist almost like, right? Now let's go back and refresh this. Now if you see here, there are total 2 different requests happening. So let me just block the names one so that we understand this more. Because we're calling this service at 2 different components, we'll get 4 into 2, right? Whenever exception happens, each component calls the service, and each will does 4 iterations of trips, right? So for instance, what I'm going to do, I'm going to go to employee names here, go to component, and then let me just comment this trip, okay? So that if I come back here, now I have this employee works only, right? So I'm doing the trip only from personal info. Now see here what is happening. So this is the first trip, right? So when it actually made the first trip, it got 404. Like when I go into the main response here, sorry, the response here, or even from the headers, you can see 404 is not found, because we don't have this URL under the server, right? Now it says 404, fine, which means I got a invalid response. Perfect. Now let's make how many trips I said. So here we made the service to make 4 trips, right? Now what it will do, you can see here, it makes 1, 2, 3, 4. Every time what happened? Every time it actually checked the endpoint, but what it does, every time it failed, right? So here what it is doing now, it will actually propagate the error. So now let's get back to console here, right? If you see here, there is an we actually logged the error at core service. The first step, it handled it. But anyways, as e is an object, right, it printed everything. We can even say e dot. We have a breakpoint here and get the details. Let's go back to sources, right, and employee service, and then let's put a breakpoint here. If I go back to this point, if you see here e in this object, right, you will see different things, right? The message, and you will see the complete object. So this complete object you can actually kind of a map into stuff. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to just call only one thing called e dot message, and the same e dot message I'm going to call from my component. So I'll go to component where I'm handling my exception. I'll say error dot message. Let's get back here. Let me just remove this and breakpoint, refresh it. So now you can see HTTP failure for so and so at core service. This is service level, and same error propagated at the component, at consumer, if you see. And if you see, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 trips it actually made. That's how it actually created the created the trips, and at one of the trip, what it did, it actually failed. You can, this block mainly you can actually use to do different things, like whatever success message and whatever it goes into failure, this failure section you can actually use it for fallback in the sense, if your request fails, what to do, kind of, that's a fallback situation what you can actually handle up here. Okay, so that's how we handle exception cases during trip calls, and then propagate it and then handle it in components. But to be very careful, this retry is not supposed to be used every time you are trying to handle exception. There should be some proper um, um, proper decision or proper requirement to be made, right? So this has to be very perspective, like it should not be used everywhere. So wherever it is required, that it won't actually create a heavy traffic with a huge data being pushed through endpoints, right? You have to decide whether that trip is important to make a retry or not. Okay, but yes, you have a provision that you can actually make a retry, and then you can actually create these stuffs. So that's how we actually create services, and then we normally call endpoints, use observables, and then handle exceptions and stuff, right? Now let's move on with the next big topic we have called routing. So till now, right? Yeah, I mean we have seen routing, but we always used to actually create multiple components and then call them directly from our app model, right? It's almost like not a routing. We just used to have all the components being called here, right? But now we are actually moving on to the world where we always want to move from one component to other component, or one page to other page and stuff, using navigations, right? And all the navigations actually happens through routing, and Angular does have a very strong routing platform created, which we can actually utilize to actually make any type of routing between components, so which completely supports our MVVM model, which means, I mean, if you have seen the MVC stuffs with the URLs, right, where you can actually have a complete URL pasted, and you can actually access your page the same way of accessing components or pages you can actually do using the regular Angular routes. Fine. So now what we'll do, in order to understand the routes, right, first let's create a quick scenario, and then we'll actually create some routes for it. Okay. So again, I mean, we'll take the same example of employee and whatever we have, which is, let's say I have an employee list, right? And then I need a employee details, for instance, right? So these are the two different components we have, where one is for employee list and second is for employee details, for instance, right? Now, um, don't we are not going to actually pull up the service and then show everything. These are so we're not going to actually plug into any service and see. We'll first see these two as a normal components. Okay, we have a component called employee list. We have a component called employee details, right? Or let's get back into student. We were talking about employee a lot, right? Let's say we have a student list and student details. Okay, so that we're not actually confusing with other. So student list is one of the component and student details is one of the component, and we want to see these two being accessed using different URLs and different navigations. Okay. Now, so first step, what we always have to do is, if you remember, while creating our application, right, we selected something called, we want our application to be created with routing. You remember?
Mm-hmm.
Whenever we create any new application, if you're using Angular client and if you start creating a new app, the first question it does ask is whether you want to create the app with or without routing. And we selected, yeah, go ahead and create route with routing. And that will include all the files which are required for routing. We'll see each and everything, whatever is required step by step for routing. Okay. And
Mm-hmm.
then once we create one base route, and then once we create component routes, and everything else is same. Fine. So now, so even before we actually move on and create these components, the first step which we have to see is, right, like how to enable route, right? So how actually we already have this routing. So now this is time we talk about something called app routing. If you remember, we were talking about each and every file which comes under app component, right? We started with app module and then we understood all the app components, right? And then we understood the importance and significance and registration of each and every service or component with app module, right? Now, if you see the name called app routing dot module. So, do you see any similarity between these two with the name?
Module.ts.
These two are modules again, right? So
Yeah.
this itself is a module and this itself is a module. Now, our application is completely on app module and we have a routing module which is altogether a separate module. Now, see, when we talk about a module, it doesn't have to be a actual component loaded module. A module can be something which can hold a components which are components or entities which completely provides internal functional business logics also. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
that's how we can do. So now in this routing module, which is, so don't consider this as a altogether a new completely different stuff. This is again a normal module as like app module. Okay, but we are actually separating the concerns. Now, app module does have registration of all the components and stuff, and few bootstrapping stuff which are required for applications to start and monitor. And app routing does contain one of the very important stuff called Angular router registration. Fine. So I can actually move all this routing and whatever we're actually registering the routes and stuff to app module. We don't even need this. Understand in that way, okay? But to separate concerns, we have this app routing module, which we'll be using at app module. Now, if you see here, right, end of the day, these two modules have to talk, right? You can have hundreds of modules in your application. Each module contains multiple components. Component to component talk to each other, right? And one step going up, module to module talk to each other. Make sense?
Uh-huh.
We actually understood the first one. Now we are going to understand the second one. Now one of the module is going to talk to another module, and then it is going to create some functionality. Now one of the module which we always used to learn is app module. Now let's see how we can actually bind these two, right? Now if you go back to app module, right, so this routing module, what's the name of this actual class? So this app routing module is actually exported as a class called app routing module, right? And this app routing module, what we have to do, we have to register with this module. It's simple as importing a component. We import a module. I think it should have been already there, because this is Angular which created. Yeah, here we go. So we have app routing module. Can you see here? So this
Mm-hmm.
is a module which is actually kind of imported here, which means these two are now kind of connected for communication. And the same app routing module is also imported across imports here, which means every component which is an app module also understands what is app routing. Make sense?
Yes.
That's how it is. Now there is one more thing. If you go to index.html, this base tag, so this base tag, right, is important. So this will actually make our application understand that whatever you are do, we're going to follow this pattern, slash pattern, okay? Which means whenever we are going to create a route, we are going to create a route with a slash. Don't worry if you don't understand, we'll actually understand when we actually create one of the route, okay? Now, so the base things are, we have app module, we have app routing module. The app routing module is registered with our app module, and this is imported to, are imported and registered with the root module called app module we have. That's the first step. Clear?
Mm-hmm.
Now, moving one step ahead. So now if you see what exactly is in here, see, end of the day, what we are going to do, we are going to completely come out of app module, and we will be doing everything in app routing itself. I'll show you what exactly does that mean. Okay. Now, so when I talk about app routing module and app module, now you see that this app routing is kind of a higher level, and then which is used in app module, and app module is actually used across the components, right? So which means these are the top level, right? Make sense? Now,
Yes.
so if you see here, there are two important things which are actually kind of registered in this ng module. One, the imports of routes. As of now, if you see this constant routes, it's blank, right? So this routes and router module are the core module services we have under Angular router. So this Angular router is one of the package which gets installed when you install the Angular client, which does provide two strong, not two, there are many. But we're going to see more when we actually go ahead into components. And here you can see, in order to actually register your routes, we are using route module, right? And in route module, we're going to have the routes. So these routes, we're going to use this to register our components, which can be used with specific paths. Okay, that's the beauty here. So now, without delay, let's do one thing. Now we know that in index HTML, which is which is a startup trigger, we know that we are actually calling the base with a what exactly is the convention we have to use. We have an app routing module registered with a route module, and we have an app module where we are already registering or importing the Angular app routing module we have. Fine. Now let's go ahead. And also one more thing, in our app component, we always used to actually give, we used to, well, anyways, this is even now this is a base component we have. What I'm going to do, I'm not going to call anything now, right? I want to be clear on this app component. Now, having said that, we have created a framework for app routing or routing everywhere now with index.html and registering of this and this. There is one more thing which we have to be very careful. Now, in our base component, right, we should always have, now see, some or other component should hold whatever routes we are creating, right? We can actually create routes for 10 different components, right? But where exactly that should start? There should be some start point, right? Now, in order to create a start point for route module base, right? So we're gonna use our base component itself. So in the base components, in order to make these routes understand, we're gonna have something called route. We have outlet. So this is the base element which it should always be there in your root component. Okay, and this will automatically make sure whatever routes we are actually registering, right, those will be mounted on top of this, and this will automatically decide which component to load. Okay, now without delay, let's do one thing. Let's create two different components. Okay, so now let me go back to this and say I need I want a new NGGC, let's say student list. We want a student list one. Perfect. So we got a student list. Now let me create student details, for instance. So I have my student details now. Perfect. So now let me go into those components. So I have a student list here. Let me just delete whatever files are not required. I don't want my CSS one. Let's say I don't want my spec file. So gone. We'll go to student details, and then I don't want this file. And also, see, if you don't want to actually do all this, whatever we are doing, we have a direct command. I'll give you the command where you can actually directly create a inline HTML, inline styles, and everything inline, which will create a direct component for you. Okay, I'll give you that part too. So here now, yes, we have a component called student details component, and then we have a specific HTML called student details works. Similarly, student list and student list components. Now, if I go back to app module, first step in app module, as soon as we create components, right, it will get registered, correct? And these two will automatically get declared or registered with our root module. Now, till now, what we have seen, we always used to see the registration of components as soon as we create with our app module. Now, how can I register these for routes? Let's see. Let me go back to the app route.module. Now here, if you see, these are the routes right now. Here, I can actually have any number of routes defined in my routes here, because these are the routes which are actually registered with the route module we have in Angular. Now, how to define that? So the first, we can actually have any number of, like I can have in flower brackets, I can give any number of routes I want, right? First one, let's give for first one called the student list, for instance, right? So what's a path we need? So if anyone try to actually hit student list page, then we want to call the component called student list component. Fine. So here, what is that? Let me just remove this for a moment. My mistake, right? So this is a route. So what's this? So if someone tries to go into student list, now this will load a component called student list component. And this student list component can be a big page, one big component where there are, 10 different components called to actually make a complete page. You're getting the picture, right? So let's go back and see. Okay, cool. Everything is good. Now, going back to the app component.html here, as of now, we have nothing. So let me just create a simple header tag, for instance, right? let me call it as a base, let's say component, right? Anyways, the slash will automatically come up. Why? Because in my index.html, we already gave a slash, right? It
Yes.
does know the pattern it needs. So if I go to app routing module, if I give the student list, right, it should automatically take my routing. Now, anyways, so this is the base component I have, right? So now if I type in student list here, can you see?
Yeah.
So this is a route we have, and this route is coming from a different things now. Now let's combine everything what we did. Now we registered the student component here, you remember?
Yes.
And this app route module is registered here, app routing, and this app routing is kind of important for every component, right? And in the same app module, we already have the student list also registered, right? And this student list component is the component refers to this component we have, correct? And this component have a HTML called component HTML, and it says student list works. That's how it is connected. Clear? Now,
Mhm.
if you see this, right, you will find something which is getting duplicated. You see. So now what we are doing, we have imported this component here, and student list component is used here, right? But we are already using this app routing module, which already contains this import, right? So which means you don't have to actually duplicate these. So from now on, you don't have to actually import the components here. So I can just remove components now as we are using the student list and stuff here, and then anyways we are actually defining the routes here. So the next route for me is student details, right? Student details, for which I'm going to use a component called student details component, right? So these are the two components I have. So instead of doing that, what I'm going to do, I'm going to create a constant called registered components, for instance, something registered components, and I'm going to actually register everything here. So student details and student components and stuff. Okay. Now, so see, whatever you export in a module, that can be imported wherever this module is important. Okay. So now I'm going to use this registered. So where I'm actually importing it here. So what I can do, I can import app module and also my constants defined. And this registered components, what I'll do, I'll just define here. Getting the picture? So this
Yeah.
registered components, what exactly it is? It does include the components which are these two. So these two components are here, and this we are declaring means these two. When you say registered components, it does include all of them, whatever is here. Okay,
Mhm.
that's how it is. So now we know that we have defined the student details and student list, and we have student details and student list components tagged to those routes. Now let's get back here. Now we know student list, right? Let's create student details. You can say student
Mhm.
details works and student works. So this is how we create a route for our components. Now you may get a question, let's say for instance, now do you have any questions till now? So
Like when we use this, I'm not getting.
sorry.
When in which situation we create for components with routes?
uh, I mean any situation, like for instance, see, if you take a big component, right, let's say student details is a big component, right? Now, inside student details, you'll have multiple components. Like, let's say in student details, you have a student personal info, you have a student academic record, you have student like whatever gaming record and stuff, right? So for all the other components which you have child components like 10 to 15 child components, you are using one big component, parent of component called student details. So you will be creating route for that one component. Make
Yeah.
sense? So in order to give you in a ASP.NET MVC way, so you will be creating route for a main view. Okay, main view controller, right? And then inside that view, you'll be creating multiple partial views. Okay, let's say for
Mhm.
instance, each partial view gives you each functionality, like a student details, student personal info, student gaming info, and stuff. But the route is created, the action result is created for a for action method you created. The action method will have one view tag, and that one view internally can call hundreds of partial views. Make sense?
Mhm.
Similarly, here we are creating route for the parent one. Now that's why I said each functionality. Let's say if you say student details, you'll have many things, right? And if you say like a student list, which means you'll show the list of student list. That's how you create. So it all depends on. It's like registering a page. Okay, it's like you are creating a route for a page. Take it that way. When I say component, don't look component in a small. A page itself is a component you are treating. A component itself you are treating as a page itself. Okay, that page can have a header and a footer, which is common across the whole application, for instance, right? And then you have a content, and the content is something which you're gonna edit. That's how. Just think this component, which for which see. If you're creating a route for a component, which means you are actually planning for a new page.
Mhm.
Okay, and in that page you can actually have multiple child components. Make sense?
Yeah.
So that's for those type of components you create a route. Okay, so now sometimes well, anyways, now I'm actually typing in here. We'll also see how we can actually create a navigation. Okay, don't worry about that. We're gonna see the navigation also. So for instance, what happens if I actually try to route to the wrong URL? So by default, what happens is it actually takes, if there is nothing by default, what it does, as we have a base in our index.html, if you see the href slash is nothing but go to the root URL, and for any site, what's the root URL? The actual domain URL itself is a root, right? But
Mhm.
sometimes we don't want to show that. Sometimes whenever we have a bad URL or anything which doesn't exist in our website, then what we have to show them a proper message saying something what you're trying to access is not available, and so on, right?
Yeah.
Yes, we also have that pattern here. So let me just create a new very quick component here. Now let me show you how to create a quick template without creating all this. So I'm gonna say ng generate component. Let me call it as page not found, right? So you can actually give some arguments to this. So I can say it, which is like a inline template. I can, if you want only inline template, you can have, so that it will not create a separate HTML file for you, right? And for instance, if you want HTML file and if you don't want CSS file, just say yes, which is inline style. Let me create this one. Excuse me. Can you see here? It doesn't create the CSS because the CSS will be automatically inline. So that's what is page not found, right? So if you see this part, page not found is a component created. Let's say this says this, or you can just say page you are looking for doesn't exist, something, right? So now let's see how we can actually assign this component. Again, this, when we talk about component, when I say component, think as if you're talking about a base page, and in this base page you can have multiple components being called. Okay. Now let's get back here. So what you can do, you can always have a default route, or now we're not talking about default route. This is something which we are calling if any route is not found then what to do. Okay, so now in order to do that, you can actually use a path again. So the convention is 2 stars. So no route match, what to do is to route to page not found component. So this is a page not found component. Now, anyways, in the app module, this component would have already added, but best practice is always use import only at one place if you have multiple modules. Okay. But anyways, as of now, I'm just leaving it. So now let's go back here. Now can you see? If I this was a page not found. Now if I go here, now if even if I go to the root, right, it says page you're looking for doesn't exist. Why? Because it understands only the routes which are registered here, right? So this is one more. Now this is called as a wildcard route. So here, for instance, if I go to student list now, right, it works. Student list works because it understands what it is. If I go to student details, it works. If I try to go into some other URL, now even this is also fine. If you see here, it persists um, my URL and says I mean whatever you're looking for is doesn't found. Let me just change this page. You are looking for doesn't exist, right? Now in these situations where we are actually talking about invalid, I mean the URL which actually doesn't have the data, right?
Yes.
But if I it doesn't mean that some of the URLs which are actually a loading URLs, or which you want to say that okay, few URLs you want to actually handle, but it should not actually match like a unregistered routing, right? So the one which we use is like a wildcard which we have, and then even the wildcard, if you use wildcard, will strictly follow whatever you actually mentioned here. If you have these two, it understands that okay, these two are the ones which you have registered. Now in order to actually get rid of what you have and you want to bypass some of them, some of the URLs which are proper but it does strip this, you have to use a routing, kind of a redirect routing. Now again, there is one more important point. You should always give your the else case, I mean invalid, yeah, mismatch case always at the end. Okay, because it does actually go into each of the matching components, and then if it doesn't find, it automatically trips this. That's how it works. If you actually give this anywhere between, or if I give the first, right, what happens? So for everything, for instance, if I try to go to student list, right, because even if I go here, it does matches this, right, it does matches this pattern. It says page not found or everything. So that is something which is very important. It's like if it doesn't find, then always keep it at the bottom. Now in order to actually get rid of the valid URLs but which are valid but still it actually moves to redirects to page not found, we have to have a redirecting or rerouting, we normally call. So how to do that? So now what I can do, so the path, if you see the root path, as of now I don't have anything, right? You can also say I need something called test ABC and some path, and that need to be a valid one even if it doesn't match. Yes, you can do that. As of now, as it doesn't have anything, yes, I'll say okay, fine, path with just domain and nothing else. What to do? I want to redirect to, right? So now when I say redirect to, which means I don't want to actually say as a page not found, but I want to redirect to some base. So for now, let's say the base is itself is student details. See, you can actually make any page, any component as a base page, right? Or if you have a home, you can also make home,
Mhm.
right? excuse excuse me. So here we are trying to redirect to something. So now let's say I'm going to pick the student list itself or student detail itself. So this is my or student list does make sense. Like whatever happens, my student list should be here. Now for the redirect, you should have like this. So it says that, okay, fine, to my current URL, just append and redirect to the student list. That's how it works. Okay. And then once you have this, then you have to mention what type of path you're actually giving. So there are some types which it actually takes, basically, which is kind of a matcher, right? And always give. It depends on it. I mean, if you want to give always, I mean, full match path, you can give. If you want to give a partial match path, or if you want to give a wildcard match path, it all depends on whatever. One second. So it is match. Okay, path match. So because we are actually planning to give this path what it matches. So this full. So now if I go back here and try to access student list, works. Let's say student details, works as is. Let's say I want to go to home, it says student list. And if I give something wrong, it says page not found. All your routes work properly. So that's your redirect. So redirect also should be for the proper paths you're actually using, right? So that this will be served first, and then if something doesn't actually match, then it actually goes to the wildcard uh, wildcard path, and it just browse whatever component you say that, okay, if something is not found, do this stuff. That's how your route actually works. Any question here?
Yeah.
Okay. So now these are the routes and wildcard routes and redirects which we have. Now for these components, right, instead of actually relying on the URLs, in our next class we'll see the navigation, how we can actually create navigation and navigation with params and stuff. Okay.